Hi everybody. So in this video, we are going to take a little look at the human impact on the nitrogen cycle. So this is part of specification point 3.5.4 nutrient cycles in your specification. And as you can see at the bottom here, you need to be able to talk about the use of natural and artificial fertilizers to replace nitrates and also phosphates lost by harvesting plants and removing livestock. Now, we're only going to be focusing on the nitrates in this video, and the phosphates will be covered elsewhere. You also need to be able to talk about the environmental issues associated with human impacts on the nitrogen cycle. So this is just a little recap of the nitrogen cycle. And if you remember, within this diagram, wherever you see an arrow, that's representing a process that allows the flow of nitrogen atoms. Okay, so for instance, if we start with nitrogen gas in the atmosphere, nitrogen atoms exist as nitrogen molecule N2. Now, this is a really, really strong molecule because the two nitrogen atoms are held together by a triple covalent bond, which is incredibly strong, very difficult to break. And so nitrogen gas in that form is not a very biologically useful form. And so part of the nitrogen cycle is converting that nitrogen molecule into something that is more easily usable by biological organisms. So the first step in doing that is called nitrogen fixation. So nitrogen fixation can either happen through lightning, and the energy within a lightning strike is enough to break that triple bond, and then the nitrogen atoms combine with oxygen atoms from water vapor in the air to create nitrate. Okay, and that's probably the best form of nitrogen fixation, but unfortunately doesn't happen all too often because, of course, you don't have lightning happening every second of every day. Now, whenever you talk about anything associated with the nitrogen cycle, we always need to talk ourselves around to nitrates. Nitrate is the ion that is the most biologically useful form of nitrogen. So whatever we do, we need to try and increase the concentration of nitrates present in soil, for instance, so that plants can then absorb those nitrates and therefore absorb the nitrogen atoms through their roots. And as we learned in the nitrogen cycle, that is promoted by a microorganism called mycorrhizae, that you can see there, helps plants to absorb not just nitrates, but also water more readily from the soil. And then once plants have absorbed the nitrate ions, they can then, through various different processes within their cells, they can then utilize the nitrogen atoms that are present there to form biological molecules that contain nitrogen. So as you know, plants, or most plants, can photosynthesize, and through photosynthesis, they produce glucose. That's the main organic molecule that is the direct result of photosynthesis. But plants actually have lots of mechanisms within their cells to then take that glucose molecule and convert it into lots of other different biological molecules. So the most obvious being starch and cellulose, or disaccharides such as maltose, for instance. But plants can use the basic glucose molecule to form certain amino acids, for instance, to make proteins. But of course, glucose doesn't contain nitrogen naturally, and so the nitrogen atoms need to be sourced from elsewhere, which is why nitrate ions are really important for plants to absorb. And it's not just proteins. We're talking about being able to synthesize nucleotides so that the plants can form DNA and RNA, so that when they grow and produce more cells, obviously the DNA needs to be replicated. And to produce proteins in the first place, through transcription and translation, you also need mRNA and tRNA. So nitrogen is essential to make those molecules too. We tend to focus more on the production of proteins, though, because, of course, proteins control all of the cellular reactions. And in order for a plant to grow, proteins are really important. And lots of exam questions are more geared around investigations that are looking at the dry mass of plants or dry mass of any organism for that matter. So removing the water, and the mass that you're left with is the biomass of the organism. And you can take the dry mass measurements at various points in an organism's life, and you can track growth and things like that. So, so we tend to just talk about proteins, but just keep in the back of your mind that obviously the nucleic acids, DNA and RNA also contain these nitrogen atoms that are so important. Okay? And then obviously those nitrogen atoms are transferred to any consumers. So animals will feed on the plants. They'll then digest the proteins specifically within the plant. And we're only, like I say, talking about proteins because they're nitrogen containing compounds. Obviously, they're going to be digesting the lipids and the carbohydrates as well, but we're just focusing on the nitrogen containing molecules here. So they'll digest, so they have enzymes to hydrolyze the bonds, get our smaller amino acids back, which they can then absorb into their cells. And then once the amino acids are in the cells, they can put them back together again in assimilation, which is forming the peptide bonds again through condensation reactions to make their own proteins. And that's why it says animal proteins there in the box. Okay, and then of course we've got the decomposition of any animals and plants or their waste products. Now, this is also called ammonification because the end product are ammonium ions. Now, this all takes place through organisms that we can collectively call saprobionts, but you might also know them just as decomposers or detritivores. So we're talking about bacteria, fungi, and then animals such as earthworms and woodlice that feed off dead organic matter. And through that process, the result is ammonium ions. Now, ammonium ions can also be produced through this initial process of nitrogen fixation. So, like I said earlier, that can happen directly by lightning, breaking that triple bond between the nitrogen atoms in the nitrogen gas in the air. But in the absence of lightning, we need an alternative way to produce nitrate ions. So it's a little bit of a roundabout two-step process, but we can have nitrogen fixation occur to produce ammonium ions rather than nitrate ions. So these ammonium ions are being produced by what we call nitrogen fixing bacteria. And if you remember from your specification points, you don't need to know the names of those bacteria. We've put them here for extension purposes and because we know that you'll see them elsewhere, so you'll be aware of the names and you can use them in exam questions, but you're not expected to. So we can just call them nitrogen fixing bacteria. And there are two types. So one is called Azotobacter, and that actually lives by itself in the soil. The other, Rhizobium, has a symbiotic relationship with certain types of plants, and those plants are called legumes. So we're talking about peas, clover, and beans. They're the three main types. And if you were to dig them up and take a look at their roots, it looks like the roots have got little knobbly knees. That's the only way I can describe it. And these little bulges, these little knobbly knee-looking things, actually contain a cluster of these Rhizobium bacteria cells. So they all live within these nodules on the roots, and what they gain are the sugars that the plant is producing through photosynthesis and obviously transferring down to the roots for storage via translocation, but the bacteria can then access that sugar for their own respiration. And what the plant gains is a source eventually of nitrates. So the plant has a source of nitrogen that they can absorb in order to produce their proteins. So it's a symbiotic relationship in that both of them are benefiting from living together. Okay. Now, both types of nitrogen fixing bacteria have two enzymes that are responsible for converting the nitrogen gas into ammonium ions. So the nitrogen gas, N2, is the substrate for these enzymes, and ammonium ions are the product. So those enzymes are nitrogenase and nitrogen reductase. And they actually need anaerobic conditions in order to work. So this is extension now. It's going a little bit beyond the specification. But if you remember when we looked at transporting animals, we talked about hemoglobin, and we talked about how hemoglobin has an affinity for oxygen atoms, and hemoglobin binds to oxygen atoms quite readily. And the more that bind to the hemoglobin, the more can bind. Now, with the legume plants that I was just talking about, they've got a molecule that's very, very similar to hemoglobin, and it's called leg hemoglobin. And what that molecule is responsible for is binding to any oxygen molecules that are in the immediate vicinity of the roots of those legume plants, and therefore removes the oxygen from that immediate area, creating a little pocket of anaerobic conditions that those enzymes then work in. So that's really, really cool. Like I say, it's taking it a little bit beyond the specification, but if you're interested in things like that, it's something you might want to have a look at. And the extension material is in your study guide. So once those ammonium ions have been formed, like I say, they're not terribly useful for plants. We need to get nitrate ions formed. So this process of nitrification then happens. So the ammonium ions are converted into nitrate ions via this two-step process called nitrification. So one type of bacteria will convert the ammonium ions to nitrite ions, and then the nitrite ions are converted by a second bacteria to nitrate ions. And remember, you don't need to know the names of them. Okay? You can just call them nitrifying bacteria because they carry out the process of nitrification. But the names are there: Nitrosomonas and Nitrobacter. Okay? But like I say, it's just extension. You can call them nitrifying bacteria, but can you see that nitrification requires aerobic conditions? Okay? And then finally, we've got our nitrate ions. If you remember, there is a process, which is one we don't want to happen, called denitrification. So this, again, is carried out by bacteria called denitrifying bacteria. Again, the name's there: Pseudomonas denitrificans. You don't need to remember that, thank goodness, I hear you say. But this works predominantly in anaerobic conditions, and that can unfortunately convert our nitrate ions back to nitrogen gas in the atmosphere. We don't want that to happen. Okay, we want nitrates to be in high supply in the soil, and we want them to be being absorbed by our plants in the soil so that they can utilize the nitrogen for making their proteins. We don't want the nitrates to be converted back to nitrogen gas because obviously, like I said earlier, this is not a biologically useful form. Okay, so that's something we don't want to happen. So what we're going to do is take a look at each of the stages of the nitrogen cycle and how humans can impact that particular stage. Okay? You need to know, particularly in agriculture, what farmers can do to try and maintain nitrate concentrations in their soil. That's the one thing that you need to keep in mind all the time. Nitrate concentrations need to remain high. Otherwise, the farmers aren't going to be able to grow their crops as well. They're not going to have very big yields. And at the end of the day, what do they want to do with their crops? They want to sell them. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay, so this is the first step that we're going to take a look at. So nitrate ions, like we said earlier, are absorbed from the soil through the roots of the plants, and then the plants use the nitrogen atoms within the nitrate ions to produce their own proteins. Okay, so how can humans impact that particular step? So in other words, how can humans ensure that that step happens more? Okay, because obviously it's going to happen naturally, but when we're working in agriculture, for instance, we need to try and promote this step to happen more often than what it would naturally. Okay? So what we can do is we can artificially add nitrates to the soil. Okay? So farmers can buy nitrogen-based fertilizers which contain nitrate ions and literally spray them on the field. So you don't need to rely solely on nitrification happening. So remember, that was converting the ammonium ions into the nitrate ions. That will be happening, but if we add nitrates in the form of an artificial fertilizer, we can add more. Okay, so what's the advantage of this? It means there are more nitrates that the plants can absorb, therefore they can increase their protein synthesis, which means the plants will grow more, and more growth means more profit for the farmer. Brilliant. However, okay, we do have some disadvantages. Okay, so this is just a reminder of the advantages there. Like I say, always think profit, profit, profit. Farmers working in agriculture, that's their main source of income, selling their crops or selling their livestock. So we need to talk ourselves into a situation where the nitrate ions in the soil are maintained at a high concentration so that the plants can be absorbing it. Like I say, if the farmer is harvesting the crops, well, then they're taking away plants that would otherwise be decomposed. And if they're not there decomposing, you're going to break the nitrogen cycle. So we need to find a way to replace the nitrates that we're going to lose when we take the crops away, okay, so that we can keep the cycle going. And the best thing is you don't need any specialist knowledge. You can just take the fertilizer and spray it yourself. So there's no added cost apart from the cost of the fertilizer in the first place. Okay, but like I say, there are disadvantages, and this is the main disadvantage that you need to learn about. And you might have heard of it already at GCSE, but probably more associated with maybe your geology course than your science course. But it's called eutrophication. Okay, eutrophication. Now, this is where you apply your fertilizer to the field. So you've got your nitrate-based fertilizer. Brilliant. All your plants can absorb your nitrates and grow. However, the downside is if they're not absorbed fast enough by the plants, well, then obviously you've got a field rich in nitrates there. And what can happen when it rains or when the farmer irrigates the crops, all of those fertilizers can start running off the field and run into rivers, lakes, and other waterways that are naturally present around where this farmer's land would be. Okay? Now that's called leaching. So we talk about fertilizers leaching into rivers and lakes. Now, why is this a disadvantage? Well, if you look at rivers and lakes and other bodies of water, you often see a green film along the top, which is actually algae, so little microscopic organisms that are photosynthesizing organisms that are growing on the surface of the water. And if you have these nitrate-based fertilizers leaching into the rivers and lakes, well, you're actually now providing a nitrate source for the algae. And the algae themselves will start to absorb the nitrates and utilize the nitrogen atoms to produce their own proteins and therefore their own growth and multiplication. And what they do is grow really, really quickly, and completely start to cover the whole of the surface of the lake or river that they're on. Okay, and what that then does means that light won't be able to penetrate through that layer, and it won't be able to reach any plants that are living on the surface of the lake and the river underneath, so on the bed of the river or the lake. So those aquatic plants now won't be able to photosynthesize, which means they're going to die, because they can't produce the glucose that they need for respiration. So the plants will die if they can't photosynthesize. So all of this is under the water. Now, they will be decomposed. So in the water, the dead plants will start to be broken down by bacteria, which feed off the dead organic matter. And then the bacteria will then start to multiply really rapidly because the bacteria have got lots of nutrients in terms of, say, glucose, and they'll start respiring. So all of this is inside the water. The bacteria now are really, really abundant. The bacteria respire, and the bacteria start to use up all of the oxygen that's in the water. Okay? Now, that oxygen obviously is not going to be replaced. So because the oxygen's not replaced, because the plants are dead, that has a knock-on effect. So any animals that are in the water, such as fish, for instance, they now don't have a supply of oxygen for their own respiration, and so then the fish start to die. So this is a real big problem that we can have if we use artificial fertilizers that are nitrogen based that then start to run off into the rivers and lakes. So like I say, you need to know how humans can impact certain stages of the nitrogen cycle and what that impact is. So there's always going to be advantages and always disadvantages, some more than others, and that's what you need to be able to discuss. Okay, so let's look at this step, okay? So denitrification. So this, remember, is when the nitrate ions are converted back into nitrogen gas in the atmosphere. And this is a step that we don't want to happen. Okay? We don't want the nitrates to be converted back into nitrogen gas because our plants then will have fewer nitrate ions to absorb and use in protein synthesis. So this is something we want to stop happening. So in terms of human impact, what can we do what do we do that might lead to this happening, and what can we do to stop it? Okay, so remember, this needs anaerobic conditions. So the problem we've got now, especially in modern agriculture practices, we've got lots and lots of new machinery, heavy machinery that farmers use when they're tending to their crops and when they're managing their land. Now, that heavy machinery used day in, day out can start to compact the soil. So press it down and really compact it. And what that does is it reduces the amount of air pockets that are present in the soil. So if you reduce the amount of air pockets, well, then you're obviously reducing the amount of oxygen that's present. Okay, so it really compacts the soil and therefore encourages anaerobic conditions to form. Okay. And at the same time, it can also lead to flooding. So any water that floods the land, any air pockets that might be present will get flooded with water, and that again leads to anaerobic conditions. The oxygen needs to be in gaseous form. It can't be dissolved within the water and still be utilized by plants, for instance. So the heavy machinery compacting the soil, okay, promotes this step. Okay, so what's the big deal? Well, like I said before, you're going to have fewer nitrates in the soil, which means that the plants aren't going to be absorbing as many nitrate ions, which means their protein synthesis will decrease, which means their growth will decrease. Okay? And like we say, if we have a decrease in plant growth, it means we're going to have a decrease in the whole crop yield. So we're not going to be able to make as much money. So the profits are going to decline. Okay? Also, you might have spent lots of money on nitrates, as in nitrate-based fertilizers. All of that will be lost because the nitrates within the fertilizer will be converted into the nitrogen gas. So not only are you not going to be able to sell your crops for as much money because you don't have as many, you're also losing the money that you've spent on the fertilizers. So it's a vicious cycle there. Okay? And then you are harvesting still your crops anyway. So any nitrates that are present in the plants that you're removing through harvesting to sell, they're lost as well. Okay, so how we can reverse this and stop this from happening is by regularly ploughing the ground. So if you regularly turn the soil over through ploughing, well, then you're introducing air pockets, you're introducing oxygen, so you're introducing aerobic conditions. Okay, and as much as you can do that, you're going to reduce the chance of encouraging denitrification because you will avoid anaerobic conditions. Okay, so let's have a look at this step. So this is a nitrogen fixation step. So the nitrogen gas being converted into the ammonium ions. So this, like we say, is promoted by nitrogen fixing bacteria. And there are two types. So some of them are just present in the soil, but a lot of those nitrogen fixing bacteria are living in this symbiotic relationship with the legumes. So we call them leguminous crops. And if anybody does French, you'll know legume is French for vegetable. Okay? But peas, beans, and clover, they have this symbiotic relationship with the nitrogen fixing bacteria. So what we can do to promote this step is we can grow lots of peas, beans, and clover. And what farmers normally do, you may have heard of crop rotation. So they'll grow their crop in one season, and then in the next season, they might grow peas or beans or clover, but they grow them to promote the amount of nitrogen fixing bacteria present in the soil rather than to harvest them. So what they do is they grow these leguminous crops, promote this nitrogen fixation step, so there's a high concentration of ammonium ions in the soil, and then they don't harvest the crops. They actually leave the crops to die, and then when they plow the soil, they plow those dead leguminous crops into the soil. So you're also then promoting the decomposition step again, which produces ammonium ions as a product. So why is this good? Well, if we've got lots of ammonium ions, well, then that's the start of nitrification. So nitrification will convert them into nitrite ions and then nitrates. So the more ammonium ions you've got in your soil, the more you'll promote the production of nitrates, which then in turn means more nitrates for your plants to absorb, increases their protein synthesis and increases their plant growth, increases your crop yield, increased profits, and so on. Okay. Likewise, so this promotion of increasing your ammonium ion concentration can be impacted on by animals. So, for instance, if you have cows and sheep and goats and other livestock on your land, you leave them to roam. And like all animals, they'll urinate, they'll defecate, so their urine and their feces will be present for the decomposers to start feeding off the dead organic matter. Now, unfortunately, obviously, animals will die too, but obviously not often, but you would have maybe the dead animals too. Okay. And like I said before, any plants that you don't harvest. So if you've grown your leguminous plants purely to promote nitrogen fixation, well, then you could plow them in instead of harvesting. Sometimes farmers actually even leave their crops. So for instance, wheat that they sell to make flour, if they've had a bad season, if it's not grown too well, or if the cost per ton is less than the cost of them harvesting it, well, then they'll just plow it back in. They just won't bother harvesting it and selling it at all. So the dead plants that they're ploughing in, and then, like I say, the waste from the animals, and unfortunately sometimes the dead animals themselves, can be left to promote decomposition, or remember that is also called ammonification. So we increase our ammonium ions in that way. And the advantages are exactly the same as what we've just discussed. So more ammonium ions means you've got an increased amount of nitrification happening, which means you're going to increase your nitrate concentration, which means plants can absorb more nitrates, more nitrogen for protein synthesis, increased growth, higher crop yields, more profit. Okay. So what we've got here, and this is in your study guide as well, is a table outlining all the different activities that humans do which impact the nitrogen cycle. So what we've done is listed the activities against the stage in the nitrogen cycle that they affect. And you've then got a column that you can use to summarize all of this information. So what are the consequences? Are there any advantages? Are there any disadvantages? So you can use this to summarize that information. And this is the kind of information that you will be asked to draw upon in exam situations. And if you want to have a go at doing that now, based on what you've just listened to, if you want to pause the video at this point, the answers are on the next slide and you can check. They're also in your study guide too. Okay, so like I say, there's the answers. Outlining the consequences of each of the human actions. Okay, so like I say, it's a good revision resource, but if you've had a go yourself first, you can use this as a visual check. We also have this diagram here that you can use as well to summarize eutrophication. So lots of exam questions actually present this as a diagram. And here we've got numbers 1 through to 5. And what you can do is you can use this information on this slide, so numbered 1 to 5, and there are some blanks there which you can get the answers to from one of the previous slides, so you can go back and double check your learning, but you can use this as a little revision tool as well. So can you identify the missing words, and then the numbers 1 to 5 here correspond to the numbers 1 to 5 on the diagram, so you can, like I say again, use that to create a little bit of a revision poster for you. So in summary, you know the different stages of the nitrogen cycle, but what you need to know, taking that further, is how human activity can either increase or decrease that step from happening, and what potentially are the advantages and disadvantages of doing that.